agile than we are. So what do you think the role of entrepreneurs should be in civic life?
I think the first responsibility is to be an active participant in civic life. Politics happens to you whether you think you're in politics or not. The way we talk about it in America is you're either at the table or you are on the menu. And I prefer to be the eater and not the eaten. And so I think entrepreneurs often disassociate themselves from politics because it's seen as gross or ineffective. But by removing the entrepreneur from that space, you give the other communities opportunities to leverage you without your permission and without your engagement. I think number two, entrepreneurs should run for office, in part because standing for office forces new conversations. And if you want your issues to be given credence and credibility, then being a part of the conversation is important. But third, I do think it's innovation. It's the fact, bless you, that those who are in those spaces facing those problems are often the ones to come up with the most interesting solutions to those problems. The challenge is that often entrepreneurship is driven by a profit motive, and a profit motive often operates in direct conflict with a social impact need. And so the tension is, can you come up with something that does good and does well? That's the sweet spot, and it's hard to find. And there's a disincentive often to try to do good and do well. People want you to do well first, and eventually you'll get back to doing good. That tends to run counter to the needs that you're talking about. But I would say that there are moments where doing well and doing good is possible, and it's finding how your insertion into that space can solve a problem that government can't solve and can do it in a way that's cost effective or that relieves them of responsibility, because political leaders are very happy to buy solutions if you can demonstrate that your idea will solve this problem and relieve them of the responsibility for not having done something about it.
And then I guess the other question that I see happening a lot in entrepreneurial communities now is a question of ethics, or at least maybe better said foresight, that you have a lot of entrepreneurs that create really clever technologies that then may have unintended consequences. So for example, Facebook looks really cool to all of a sudden looks like data was a secondary concern to growth. As you were saying, the profit motive wins. Or, a lot of companies that kind of grew really quickly because they disintermediate human resources end up then meaning that a lot of people are unemployed. So, if all of a sudden we move to connected cars, then you don't have all of these truck drivers and cab drivers, and what are they going to do next? So what is the role of the entrepreneur then when creating a technology? On the one hand, you want to scale really quickly and grow, but on the other hand, scaling sometimes means that some people are going to be negatively affected. So how should the entrepreneur approach this? I mean, is it really your problem, or is that really, as an entrepreneur, or is that really more of a question for government, like now in the case of Facebook with regulation and stuff like that?
I believe first in the power of the mind, and so I do not believe you disincentivize anyone's ingenuity and innovation. I do think the reason we create government, and I think it's always important to remind us of what government is. Government is us, whether we participate or not. It is the selection of people to be representative of our thoughts and needs. But when government runs amok, it's often because we disassociate ourselves from the very people we've put in power. And when no one's watching you, you're going to do whatever you want. And so political leaders will act accordingly, just like anyone else. I mean, it's like hiring someone to, run a shop. When you say, here are the keys to the cash register, I'm leaving for 2 to 4 years, don't steal anything, and show up to work every day. How many of you would do that with a 17-year-old? And yet we do that with political leaders. We do not hold them accountable. And so the ethic is not the ethic of creating a product. I mean, that's the challenge that has always attended science and technology and advancement. We always create things that can be misappropriated for good or evil. The issue is making sure that those of good intention and goodwill have the power to manage how it's deployed. And so Facebook in and of itself is not a bad thing. It is those who've been able to manage it and the degree of attention paid to that management that's really most important. I would not say that we should ever block creation, but we have to think about the consequences of that creation. Automation is going to be harmful to a number of middle to lower class workers. And because it's not just the drivers, it's those who are doing the programming who suddenly become unnecessary as we have more intelligent machines. Machine learning is a danger to those who are currently responsible for ideation. And so we have to think about what are the consequences and what are our moral responsibilities to maintaining access to employment. If we are going to shift away from massive amounts of employability, does that then require an economic decision that we haven't had to confront really since industrialization? We've done that transition poorly in the West, and we have to anticipate what it's going to look like when we face it again in the not too distant future.
And I think my last question before I open it up to you guys has to do with diversity, because I guess, you know, on Friday we'll do another event on tech, and it's about kind of getting women into entrepreneurship. If I'm honest, I don't really see that many black people in entrepreneurship, and I don't really see anyone even talking or being concerned about it. I don't really see that many support mechanisms for black entrepreneurs in the same way I might see for kind of female entrepreneurs. And even when I see female entrepreneurs, I usually see female entrepreneurs of a particular class and race. So I guess my question would be, you as someone who's had to kind of be this trailblazer that has, you know, before, I remember that when you were running against someone that they called the White Stacy, and
I didn't.
you didn't call her that, but I guess some people called her that, right? And I guess a lot of people were just like, well, we're going to go for White Stacy because actually we think she's a better candidate, not because she's more qualified, but just because we think for some reason her phenotype or her, you know, characteristics mean that she's somehow more electable. And I think that entrepreneurs go through the same thing when they come from minorities. If you don't look like central casting, which usually is a white, nerdy figure like Mark Zuckerberg, then people tend to kind of discount you. So given your role as a trailblazer, what would your advice be to the next generation of black and brown and female entrepreneurs that say, we kind of want to get into this, but when we look at the numbers, we're just not that represented, and to be fair, nothing's really changed over the last 30 years. So what would your advice be to them?
I mean, one, you know, if you feel like no one's paying attention, you're right. We know that in the United States, less than 0.5% of investment from the VC world goes to people of color. Slightly more goes to women, but it is nearly impossible. And part of the challenge is that people invest in those who remind them of themselves. Therefore, if all the money is aggregated to a certain, basically to white men, they tend to invest in people who remind them of themselves. They tend to, we all as humans use markers of race and gender to tell ourselves stories about what we're seeing. And it also is a point of comfort. We feel more comfortable believing this thing to be so because if we see ourselves in that experience, we imagine that experience is going to be replicated in the person we invest in. You know, this notion, oh, that's a good guy because he looks like me and sounds like me and we both do this thing together. The challenge for people of color, the challenge for women, is that because we were never part of that cohort, we never have the power to then replicate ourselves in the space. And so the first responsibility is to hold those accountable. Silence is a very powerful tool for those who will aggregate success to themselves. But calling people out on that is very important. And it's sometimes seen as self-defeating. If I'm the one saying that this is a bad idea, that you're not talking to me, that you're not investing in me, I'm going to get blackballed and isolated from opportunity. That leads to number two. There's power in numbers. If this cohort here decides to create a society that then does a report card on all the entrepreneurial investors and all the VCs and calls them out and says, this is what you're not doing, and you create a public stink about it, people do not like being embarrassed in public. They do not like being held to they don't like failing. And so sometimes there is success in aggregation where none of you have to be the individuals who say this is wrong, but together you can hold them accountable. And third, it is maybe, I mean, one thing I do is I have always had partners in the work I do, in part because I know that race is often a strong marker in investment. And in tech, in the businesses I've started, whether in tech or in finance, my partners have always been women, but they've also been white. And I didn't do that intentionally, but because of that, there was a very clear through line that because she had access to certain people I would never get to, we were able to raise money faster than if it had just been me alone. Sometimes there is a utility in aligning yourself with those who can get you entry, but making sure that your contract and your relationship says that once you're both in the door, you both stay inside. Because what you don't want is what happened to the other guys on Facebook who got kicked out. So you want to get through the door together, and that sometimes feels demeaning because it suggests that you are not sufficient on your own. It's not you, it is them. And so if you acknowledge that, then sometimes coalition in approach can increase the likelihood of getting those resources. But the corollary to that is once you've been successful, you've got to then return the investment to those who need it too. Because what happens is often we get in the door and we close it behind us and lock it because we don't want anyone else to diminish our success. That is wrong, that is painful, and it will never work because someone's going to pick that lock and they're going to remember who locked the door.
All right. So with that, I'm going to maybe be the roving mic or whatever you call it, unless someone else volunteers to do it.
Sure, happy to help.
But we need this mic because there's only one. Okay, so Zube, you get a mic and you go ask some questions. All right. Talk to people who are asking questions. All right, so who's going to be the first? Merci beaucoup. Mic, please.
So how do we get people of colour to mentor and coach other people of colour? Because what we tend to find is, again, it's that middle class males that go out there and do the coaching and the mentoring.
So the question is, how do we get more people of color to provide mentorship? So I'm going to, and I don't intend to do this, but I'm with entrepreneurs, so I'd be stupid if I don't. I wrote a book, and it's called, it's coming out in March. It's called Lead from the Outside. It's currently available as Minority Leader. But I call, one of the chapters is called The Myth of Mentors. We've been trained to believe that there is this phenotype of mentorship that we have to have if we want to be successful. And if you are from a marginalized or outside community, you're rarely going to get access, either because the line to get to that one person of color is so long, you'll be dead before you get in the door, or because the woman has so much else on her plate that she can't mentor you. So I believe in sort of crafting my own mentorships, particularly by finding people who don't necessarily have everything I want, but have skills that I need. And I aggregate, I essentially create a smorgasbord of mentorships. But I'm intentional about who I seek and what I seek them for. We are unlikely in the tech space, in the public space, to find mentors who look like us because they are so few that they are so overwhelmed they rarely actually can be effective as mentors. But they can be advisors. And what I think about is creating a board of advisors, creating 5 or 6 people who you may find a woman, a person of color, a white guy who is just thoughtful and putting all, not to say that they aren't, but my point is, who's thoughtful to those issues. See, I'm about to get myself in trouble. But who's thoughtful to those issues, but you put them together and you can build your own set of mentors. But this idea that there is a mentor out there is a myth. And we feel like failures because we can't find them. And so I say don't bother trying to find the mentor. Build your own model of mentorship that allows you to find different people who can advise you. Because the person who knows how to help you navigate getting access to resources may not be the person who can help you with HR issues. And that person may know absolutely nothing about how to be a good marketer of your own ideas. So find the people who are good at those things that you think you need, and then find someone that you just admire and see if there's something they'll give you. But I think we have to stop looking for that single person because they're just so few and far between. We will spend our lives in pursuit of mentorship and never actually get to learn.
Any other questions? Right here? Yep.
Hi, Stacey. My question is, for a lady that is performing at a high level within business, politics, and also literature, what is your strategy to ensuring that neither one of these competing interests undermines your performance and you maintain consistent performances year on year on?
So I call it work-life Jenga. Anybody play Jenga? Okay, work-life balance is a lie. It is a bald-faced lie told to make the rest of us feel like we're terrible people. But it applies in this instance, meaning that I do what I know I'm good at, and I get better at things before I try. I mean, I do a lot of things in parallel, but I'm always careful not to move up the ladder until I've gotten good at what I'm doing. Sometimes there's a sense of urgency. If I don't get it done by the time I'm 40, I am a failure and no one will ever love me. It's not true. I'm 45. They'll like me anyway. But the responsibility is to be true to what you want to accomplish. I love writing, but there was a moment where I had to decide between becoming the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives or getting a new contract with my publisher. And I had to turn down my contract. It was incredibly painful, but I could not in good conscience manage the book schedule they needed and do the work I needed to do to help rebuild my party. And so sometimes achieving and maintaining levels of success means sometimes saying, I can't do this thing. I had two business partners, one in the most successful company I have that I'm still a shareholder in is called Now Account. It's a financial technology company that's going really well. I no longer work there because I decided I wanted to be governor. And so part of my responsibility was to say I was not going to be an effective partner in this business. And I was willing to take the financial risk of stepping back because I had this other draw on my time. You cannot do it all at once. You can do it all, but not at the same time. And part of the responsibility is determining what drives you the hardest. I wanted to be governor more than I wanted to be the vice president of my company. And that was a hard decision to make because I like living inside my house and I enjoy paychecks. They are really good. And I had to take a risk. And so I think it's always being willing to be thoughtful and honest with yourself about where you stand, what you can do, and what you can't do. But that also means then being honest with those around you, because if you are slacking off in any space, somebody knows it. They may not tell you, but they're probably talking about you behind your back. So you need to go ahead and just acknowledge it and adapt for it and make it better.
More questions? David?
Hi, Stacey.
Hello.
I was just wondering about the role of government. So society's got lots of problems that obviously you're very aware of, be that inequality, be that climate change. And then we look at the problems that people invest in and that entrepreneurs solve. We look at the big companies coming out of Silicon Valley. What's the role of government to regulate or influence places like Silicon Valley to actually solve the challenges that society needs to be solved?
What has been most effective, although we've forgotten in recent years, is that a number of innovations have been funded by government investment. We've suddenly created this belief system that all good ideas come solely from the entrepreneurial space and that sua sponte, they become real and people invest, and that if government gets involved, it's somehow going to diminish the utility. That's completely untrue. We see government investment in smart ideas all the time. The Defense Department does it better than anybody. And many of the technological advances we've seen have come out of investments not through DARPA, through DoD, just direct investment. I believe that government has to be a more aggressive investor. We saw that play out, unfortunately, a bit under President Obama's administration when he was trying to invest in clean energy, because one failure that has government investment becomes proxy for denying everyone access. That is a terrible approach. And I think going back to Gary's question about entrepreneurship and government, we have to have leadership in government that is more entrepreneurial. Yes, there are going to be risks taken and there are going to be failed business ideas, but that doesn't mean that the ideas themselves weren't worth it. Sometimes it just means Solyndra didn't have the right management. And sometimes you have to test in order to see what works and what doesn't work. And so I believe that we need more aggressive investment. I don't believe that means regulation of Silicon Valley. I believe in capitalism. I believe that capital should go where it would go, but I think that society demands that we have a counterweight of investment and that there are incentives to move Silicon Valley towards investing in the problems that we need solutions for. And so rather than regulatory oversight, unless it's something that has really become a utility and has entirely too much monopoly power over how we live our lives, I think the role that government should play is in incentivizing, often either in competition with or in collaboration with investors to drive societal solutions that can really move everyone forward. So I've bored everyone else into complacency.
Hi, Ms. Abrams. Slightly off the topic entrepreneurship, though I'm sure you'll find a brilliant way of tying it in. 2 questions. Why are you here in London? I think it's really exciting. Secondly, I'm a New York State voter, so I never got the chance to vote for you, but your story has brought such incredible focus to so many issues. If you'd speak for a minute about what it was like to be asked to write, or what the process was upon crafting and delivering the democratic response at such a historical State of the Union address. I'd find that very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm in London because the Oxford Union invited me to come and speak. There was a very entrepreneurial young man there who was incredibly aggressive, and he got me to come to London in March. Gary and I have known each other since law school. I don't like going above the Mason-Dixon line until after June. So coming here in March, he was a very compelling, I don't like being cold. It makes me very sad. So I accepted the invitation to Oxford Union because it was a very prestigious invitation, and this young man really was incredibly gracious in his invitation. And then I called my friend Gary, who I hadn't seen since we graduated from law school, and let him know that I was coming to London. And he essentially filled the rest of my time here. I knew what I was getting into. But in particular for me, the conversation about being here is that we have common cause between America and Britain, that regardless of the leadership of our political parties, that common cause remains constant and important. And as someone who intends to continue to be a part of the body politic, I think relationships with our allies in the UK are very important, and I'm excited to be here. Writing the State of the Union response. So I was visiting with Leader Schumer to talk about my potential, yes, as a New Yorker, to talk to him about the potential of running. But before we even had the conversation about me running for Senate, he pulled me aside and he said, so I've been talking to Speaker Pelosi, and this is my year to pick the State of the Union responder, and I'm waiting for him to tell me some exciting news about who he's doing. And he said, I'd like for you to do it. And I was a bit stunned. And then I was excited, and then I was freaked out. It took approximately 3 nanoseconds. And then he called everyone in for the meeting, so I had to sit for an hour just in this larger meeting, unable to tell anyone that I'd been asked to do the State of the Union response. I didn't even have time to text my mom. I'm just thinking about this, and I'm fairly certain I agreed to do things I didn't intend to in the meeting because I wasn't paying attention. But what was so exciting was the opportunity to give voice to so many for whom the past 2.5 years have been deeply disturbing. It has been painful to watch communities I care about, the undocumented, the poor, those who lack access to health care, those who are working full-time jobs and still barely scraping by. In my campaign, I came face-to-face with so many of them, and what I knew I could do in this response was for 10 minutes give voice not only to their despair, but to the underlying belief that we continue to share in the resilience of our country. That one person, that one man cannot dismantle what America is, but that without calling out what has happened, we all together could allow that corrosion to take root, and we could forget how good we are as people. And so for me, writing the speech began with the anecdote that I tell about my dad, which really is grounded in a belief system that says we come for each other, we take care of each other, we don't allow anyone to be left behind. And that sometimes we make small sacrifices or big sacrifices that then allow someone else to have opportunity. And in the story, I talk about my dad giving his coat away because he had trust and faith that his family would be there and that we would remedy whatever sacrifice he had to make, and that as a society, we are being called to make sacrifices, things that we think we want or need, because there are people in our country right now who are facing even more dire circumstances. And so once that was my anchor point, I tried to really think through who are the people who need to hear themselves in this moment, who believe that they are no longer seen because of how the person who leads our nation speaks about them or does not. And so the second part of the speech really was focused on how do we call out those things that are going wrong, that are problematic, that are deeply disturbing. And then as a writer, there's always a third act. And the third act is calling us to better selves. How do we think about who we want to be? What do we desire? And that's the space where, I don't want him to fail. Because his failure means more people get hurt. But I also know that we are better people than we have shown ourselves to be, especially in light of voter suppression, in light of how many people have been harmed by his policies. And I wanted to remind us that there's an election coming up and we can fix what he has broken. And I had to get that all done in less than 10 minutes, and there were a few iterations. But I'm deeply grateful to both Leader Schumer and his team that they allowed me the ability to write my own speech. They gave me some edits, but they were very light, and they didn't try to frame how I did it. I hydrated before I got up there, so I didn't have to worry about reaching for water. And Joe Kennedy was kind enough to remind me not to use chapstick, so I wouldn't have glistening lips. And I had, again, an amazing team that made certain that my words were matched by the moment, and that was my speech.
I think we have time for, I saw you guys, so last two questions.
Hi, I think earlier you spoke about mindset, and I wanted to find out from you how, as a person that's navigated spaces and industries that aren't necessarily typically inhabited by black women, what is it about your mindset that's allowed you such resilience and strength in the face of kind of hostility and adversity to your presence in these places?
So there's a phrase that my sister uses. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it out loud. I basically act like a white guy. I mean, here's what I mean. Here's what there's a capacity and a certitude that sometimes comes with seeing yourself reflected in everything. When you enter a space and the normative is who you are, then your questions are internal, but they are not. And again, I don't want to diminish the true challenges faced by everyone, but when you're a person of color, you are looking for yourself. You are trying to find someone who seems to have any of your experiences and any of your doubts. And in America, the normative is white men. They've always been the leaders. They've always been the wealthiest. So I just act that way. I assume that I get to be there. I presume that I've worked hard enough to deserve to be in any space I enter, and that I have the capacity to compete with anyone. But more than that, I know that I will work harder once I'm in there than anyone else will. And so I bring with me the knowledge of my mother and my grandmothers and my sisters and my aunts and all the black women who preceded me who had to fight to create space. But I enter with a confidence that says, once I'm in there, you're not getting rid of me. And that mindset allows me to withstand some of the most hurtful, painful, embarrassing moments where people deny my humanity. There was a commercial about me where they had me climbing the side of the state capitol reminiscent of King Kong. There was another where they had tap dancers it could have been ballet, but no, they decided to do minstrel tap dancing to describe me. And I had friends, people who've known me for decades, who questioned my ability to have this job because I was a black woman. I could either internalize their diminution of me and their dismissal of my capacity, or I can know who I am and what I'm capable of and prove myself to be resilient. And that's the mindset I have. Because yes, I can make mistakes, but I know I'm smart enough to come back from those mistakes and to be better when I do it again.
I had the first question at Chatham House and the last question.
Make it very transformative.
I'll try. It's a lot of pressure.
Who are you telling?
I think you've spoken a lot about a lot of different things throughout the day, and a lot of them have really touched me because I love politics and I love business and everything in between, and even law. But the one thing that really piqued my interest was the fact that governments in different environments and VCs have to be more aggressive in terms of their investment, especially in light of
just the lack of investment that goes towards initiatives started by black women. And I understand how one can navigate that space when you have an idea that's primarily, people can look at it and see, okay, this has the ability to generate a lot of money, or this has the ability to change the way a new form of technology operates. But what about the social enterprises, the things that are started by people where in your heart you know that it's got the capacity to essentially generate an income as an app in the future, but essentially before it gets to that stage, it needs to do social good. What advice do you give to somebody who's in a position where they're trying to do that social good but need to raise capital in order to help people and pave the way to being self-sufficient and sustainable?
That is the hardest part of entrepreneurship. So as I told you, I've started multiple companies. We had a bottled water for babies and toddlers that was doing well until the collapse of the economy. We actually couldn't get credit when we had a buyer for our product. We just needed to be able to float we needed to float the equipment that we needed, and we could not get anyone to loan us $75,000, even though we had an invoice worth twice that amount, because the invoice was from a reputable company, but credit in the late 2010s, basically they said, well, we aren't going to invest in you because you're two women and we don't understand this idea, so good luck. We actually grew to death. We had to shut down our company instead of making this order. The second company I created was NowAccount, which is a financial technology company that solved the first problem. And then the most recent company I'm a co-founder of is called The Family Room. And it's designed to help children who are distanced from their family, often because of incarceration or because of work or deportation. It helps them have robust communication with their family members, with the adults in their lives, because children before the age of 11, really between 2 and 6, do not understand the phone. They don't understand Skype. They require a holistic communications hub. They need to be able to touch, see, and perform an activity to really, truly communicate. They pretend like they understand what's going on, but they really don't get that mommy's not in the room, and that's why they walk. If you ever handed a phone to a 3-year-old, you will find the phone just laying face up somewhere because the 3-year-old has just wandered away. We have solved that problem, but we have had a difficult time getting investors because it is a social good problem. And even though we believe we can monetize it and we should be able to turn this into a much broader platform, it has been hard. And so I will say that the only solution we've been able to come up with is it's patience, and it's having alternative sources of income, because social good is hard. That's why it doesn't get solved. It's why the social challenges that could be solved in an instant by Silicon Valley never get addressed. And so I said transformative, not depressing, but the depressing answer is that until we have people of goodwill who are willing to invest in social good, often those of us of good intention have to have two jobs: the job of promoting our product and the job of making a living. And it's hard to accept that, and people will lie to you and tell you you don't have to, but that's just not true. And so what I would say, though, is that the resilience of spirit that says we should solve social problems has to be so. My parents are United Methodist ministers. Their job is to save people's souls. They don't know if they're successful until the rapture. Okay? So my timeline's a lot shorter than theirs. So, and I'm in a business that by its nature is slow, plodding, rarely actually solves the problems it sets out to solve, and often in the solution creates 5 new problems no one knew were possible to create. That's government. But it's worth it, because if you have an answer to a problem, sometimes the pursuit of support for the solution introduces you to people who see the vibrancy in you, and maybe not your product, but are willing to invest in you to make your solution so. Thank you.
And so with that, thank you, the entrepreneur, Stacey Abrams.